For most of human history, we were not alone, not as a civilization, not as a species. 40,000 years ago, at least 4 distinct human species walked this earth. Neanderthals dominated Ice Age Europe for over 300,000 years. Denisovans ranged from Siberia to Southeast Asia. And deep in a Siberian cave, a child died whose DNA matched none of the others, a ghost lineage that vanished without a name. These were not primitive creatures. Neanderthals buried their dead, made jewelry, and cared for their injured in ways that required weeks of sustained effort from others. That is not animal behavior. That is something that looks very much like love. And if you had looked at Homo sapiens 40,000 years ago, small-bodied, scattered, fragile, nothing suggested we would be the last ones standing. In many direct comparisons, we were the most vulnerable species in the entire genus Homo. And yet today, only one human species remains. Which raises a question that fossils alone cannot answer. What does survival actually select for? And was our dominance ever truly inevitable? Ice Age survival was not simply about enduring cold. It was about surviving instability at a pace that biology had never been forced to match before. Climate records, extracted from ancient ice cores drilled out of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, tell a story that should genuinely disturb anyone who reads them carefully. During the late Pleistocene, the geological window in which all of this unfolded, global temperatures could swing by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a single human lifetime. Not across a millennium, not across a century. Within the span of time, a person could be born, grow old, and die. Entire ecosystems that had taken thousands of years to establish could collapse within 2 or 3 generations. Forests became tundra, grasslands became desert. Migration corridors that human groups had followed and memorized and passed down in oral tradition for centuries disappeared under advancing glaciers or rising seas, sometimes within a generation. Prey animals shifted their ranges in ways that made established hunting knowledge suddenly useless. Plant food sources that had sustained populations through lean winters vanished without warning. The environmental stability that most species depend on, as the background condition of their survival, simply ceased to exist for long stretches of time across much of the world. For most species, this kind of instability is extinction pressure, straightforward and merciless. Organisms that cannot survive the new conditions die. The ones whose bodies happen to fit the new conditions survive and reproduce. Over generations, the population shifts. This is evolution, working as designed. But what happens when the environment changes faster than that process can run? What happens when the gap between the speed of climate change and the speed of genetic adaptation becomes too wide to close? For most species, that gap is simply the end of the story. For one particular lineage of Homo sapiens, it became the pressure that forced an entirely different kind of adaptation, not faster biology, but faster thinking. Not stronger bodies, but stronger systems. Not better genes, but better culture. For roughly 3 billion years of complex life on Earth, evolution followed one rule with almost no exceptions. The body is the technology. Survival belongs to organisms whose anatomy fits their environment. The thickest fur in the coldest climate, the most efficient kidneys in the driest desert, the sharpest night vision in the darkest forest, the metabolism that runs longest on the least food. Biology is the solution. Biology has always been the solution. That is what natural selection is. At its core, a process that matches bodies to environments by killing the ones that do not fit. Then something happened in the lineage of Homo sapiens that had no clear precedent in the history of life on this planet. Survival began moving outside the body. Stone tools extended the reach and force of human hands beyond anything muscle alone could achieve, allowing small-bodied hominins to process food sources and build structures that their anatomy made otherwise impossible. Clothing replaced the fur that evolution had never given us, and did so faster, with more flexibility, and across more climate zones than any biological adaptation could have managed in the available time. Fire replaced the metabolic heat generation of larger and denser bodies and gave us something that no other species in Earth's history had possessed: the ability to cook food, dramatically increasing the caloric yield of everything we ate, which in turn fueled the metabolic demands of larger and more energy-hungry brains, which in turn produced more sophisticated tools and strategies in a feedback loop that accelerated itself. Shelters replaced the need for bodies built to withstand the elements. Language replaced instinct, turning individual knowledge into shared knowledge, turning private discovery into public infrastructure that survived the death of any single mind that had generated it. Humans became the first species whose primary survival adaptations existed not in their DNA, but in their culture. And this was not simply technological progress in the ordinary sense. It was a change in the fundamental rules of evolution, a change so profound that its consequences are still accelerating 400 centuries later and show no sign of stopping. Neanderthals were not primitive failures. That framing is not just wrong, it is almost precisely the opposite of the truth. They were exquisitely specialized Ice Age humans, the product of hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure in some of the most demanding environments complex life has ever had to navigate. Their limb proportions minimized surface area and reduced heat loss in exactly the way cold climate physiology requires. Their nasal cavities were significantly larger than those of Homo sapiens, warming frozen air before it reached the lungs. Their barrel-shaped chests housed greater lung capacity. The geometry of their muscle attachment points indicates raw physical strength that would make elite modern athletes look modest. Isotopic analysis of their bones shows a diet dominated by mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and cave bears' prey that required extraordinary coordination, courage, and tactical intelligence to hunt at close range with handheld weapons. They were not failing to survive. They were thriving for 250,000 years in one of the harshest sustained climates in the history of vertebrate life on land. By any reasonable measure, Neanderthals were not a failure. They were one of the most resilient human species that ever lived. But specialization carries a hidden cost that only reveals itself when the environment stops cooperating. The anatomical features that made Neanderthals exceptional hunters of large Ice Age megafauna became less advantageous as those megafauna collapsed under climate change and human hunting pressure. Their social groups, smaller and more geographically isolated than those of Homo sapiens, meant that when local populations were struck by disease or starvation, there was often no connected network large enough to replenish what had been lost. Flexibility does not win when the environment is stable, but when the environment begins its violent oscillations, flexibility is exactly what survives. The most consequential survival technology Homo sapiens developed may not have been the spear, or the needle, or the bow, or any physical object archaeology has ever recovered from the ground. It may have been something that leaves almost no direct trace in the fossil record. It may have been the network. Archaeological evidence consistently shows that Homo sapiens maintained deliberate social connections across dramatically larger geographic distances than any other human species appears to have done. Shells recovered from campsites in the North African interior have been traced to coastlines hundreds of kilometers away, distances that make sense only if human groups were engaged in sustained, intentional exchange across boundaries, separating them from direct daily contact. Obsidian blades found throughout the East African Rift Valley originated at volcanic sources far beyond any single group's foraging range. Ochre, pigments, and symbolic objects moved across landscapes in patterns that look very much like a trade network, the regular, purposeful movement of valued things between groups that knew each other and maintained that relationship over time. Large connected networks are not just socially pleasant, they are mathematically resilient in ways that isolated populations are not. When one node fails, one group destroyed by disease, one band whose hunters were killed in a single bad season, the knowledge and skills that node carried do not disappear from the world. They exist in other nodes. They can be recovered. The network survives the failure of its parts in a way that no isolated population ever can. A woman in a band of 40 people knows where water can be found in a drought that comes only once a generation. If she dies without passing that knowledge on, 40 people may die in conditions they had the information to survive. But if that knowledge had already traveled through a network spanning 500 kilometers, it does not die with her. It saves lives in a drought 3 centuries later that no one alive remembers her ever having predicted. That is not culture in the decorative sense. That is infrastructure. That is the kind of distributed redundancy that makes a biological system resistant to extinction. There is a moment in the story of our species no fossil can mark it precisely. No archaeological layer preserves it cleanly when something changed about how human knowledge moved through time. It was not a sudden invention. It was a threshold, crossed gradually and then irreversibly, after which the world was different in ways that compounded with every passing generation. Before that threshold, knowledge was fragile in the way that all biological information is fragile when it exists only inside individual minds. A master hunter died, and his understanding of animal behavior, the specific tracks, the wind conditions, the seasonal timing that made one hunting ground productive and another empty died with him, or survived only partially in whoever had happened to be watching. A woman who knew which plants reduced fever might pass that knowledge to her daughters, or she might not. Innovations appeared and disappeared across generations, leaving no accumulating trace, because they never persisted long enough to become systematic. What changed anthropologists call this cumulative culture is that innovations stopped resetting and started stacking. Each generation no longer began from zero. Shelter designs that proved effective were remembered, refined, and improved. Hunting strategies were passed forward with specific details intact, then elaborated by people who had the time to think because earlier strategies had already secured their food. Clothing became more sophisticated over centuries, not because any individual genius redesigned it, but because each maker began with the accumulated knowledge of every maker who came before. This created something evolution had never produced in 4 billion years, a species where the speed of adaptation was no longer capped by the mutation rate of DNA. Knowledge began evolving faster than genes, which is precisely what happened next. The story we told ourselves for most of the 20th century was clean and morally uncomplicated. Modern humans left Africa with better tools and better minds, encountered the other human species already living there, and replaced them completely, decisively, permanently. The Neanderthals disappeared because we were simply better. Every other human lineage ended because Homo sapiens was the final, definitive answer to the question of what a human being should be. Genetics has quietly and thoroughly dismantled that story. Modern humans living outside sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, not as biological noise, but as functional genetic inheritance, actively doing work in living human bodies right now. Variants linked to immune function, pain sensitivity, and the way bodies respond to certain pathogens have all been traced to Neanderthal origin. Some were actively selected for in the generations after the two populations met, meaning our ancestors' bodies recognized them as useful and propagated them forward. We did not simply replace Neanderthals, we absorbed part of what made them successful. Aboriginal Australians and populations across Melanesia carry between 3 and 6% Denisovan DNA. In Tibetan populations, a variant of the EPAS1 gene, which regulates the body's response to low oxygen at high altitude, traces its origin directly to Denisovan inheritance. The ability to live and reproduce at altitudes that incapacitate most humans within days was not something Homo sapiens evolved independently. It was borrowed from a lineage that had spent tens of thousands of years developing it in exactly the environments where it was needed. The survival story of Homo sapiens is not one lineage defeating all others. It is multiple human solutions, each refined over hundreds of thousands of years, under different pressures, merging into a single lineage that carried the best of all of them forward. We did not simply outlast the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. In a real and measurable biological sense, They are still here, in you, right now, reading this. There was no final battle between human species, no last stand at a valley's edge, no decisive confrontation where one group looked across open ground at another and understood that one of them would not survive the coming winter. The popular imagination reaches for that kind of drama, but the fossil record, the genetic record, and the mathematical models of population biology all point towards something far quieter and in many ways far more disturbing. Extinction does not usually arrive as a single catastrophic moment. It arrives the way system failure arrives in complex engineering, as an accumulation of small disadvantages that compound gradually and silently until the resilience of the system falls below the threshold required to recover from. Ordinary setbacks. The Neanderthal population in Europe was never large. Genetic analysis suggests their effective breeding populations were remarkably small, with significant inbreeding already visible in some regional groups by the time Homo sapiens began arriving in force. Small populations have less genetic diversity when novel pathogens emerge. They recover more slowly from the loss of key individuals, whose knowledge represented an outsized share of the group's total survival capacity. They are more vulnerable to cascading failures after a bad hunting season, when the hunters who die are also the ones who knew where the herds would be next spring. Add a wave of Homo sapiens expanding out of Africa, connected by networks, equipped with cumulative cultural knowledge, able to exploit a wider range of food sources, and the mathematics of population biology begin to compose a story with a predictable ending. You do not need conquest to drive a species to extinction. You need only a consistent advantage in recovery rate, a few more surviving infants per generation, a few more adults who make it through the coldest winters because their networks can share information about where food can be found when the usual sources fail. Small advantages, compounding across centuries, become insurmountable. And then one day, not with a battle cry, but with a silence that no one heard, one system disappears. And then, for the first time in more than 2 million years of continuous human evolutionary history, Earth became a one-species human planet. The significance of this is easy to underestimate because we were born into its aftermath and have never known anything else. But it was not the default condition of the world. For the vast majority of time that creatures recognizable as human have walked this planet, multiple human species shared it simultaneously, competing for resources, for habitat, for the food sources that could sustain a large-brained, energy-expensive organism through a winter that would have killed almost any other animal of similar size. When that feature disappeared, the evolutionary equation changed completely. The question was no longer which human lineage could outlast the others in the Ice Age environment of Eurasia. It became a different and more interesting question. What kinds of systems would allow a single species, starting from a small founding population with limited genetic diversity, to expand into every environment on Earth capable of sustaining complex life? The answer came faster than anyone watching from the outside might have predicted. Within a geological instant, thousands of years rather than the millions biological evolution typically requires, Homo sapiens had moved into Arctic tundra, equatorial rainforest, high-altitude mountain ranges, hyper-arid desert, and remote oceanic islands separated from any continent by thousands of kilometers of open water, crossed in boats that required planning and navigational knowledge none of our ancestors had possessed just a few thousand years earlier. The human body did not change enough in that time to explain this expansion. Biological evolution does not move that fast. What changed was the sophistication, the transferability, and the cumulative depth of the systems humans had built to extend their capabilities beyond what biology alone had given them. For billions of years, life on Earth operated according to a relationship that was fundamentally one-directional. Environments shaped organisms. Climate determined which bodies could survive where. The landscape set the terms, and life responded through the blind, patient process of natural selection. Homo sapiens broke that relationship. Fire became environmental control, not just warmth, but the ability to clear forest, drive prey, and transform landscape at a scale no other organism had achieved. Shelters became climate control, maintaining a survivable microenvironment regardless of what the atmosphere outside was doing, effectively decoupling human survival from local weather in ways no biological adaptation could replicate. Food storage became time control, the ability to eat in abundance during plenty and survive through scarcity that would have been fatal to any organism without the foresight to prepare for it. Language became coordination infrastructure, aligning the behavior of large groups around shared goals without requiring the genetic kinship that had previously been the only reliable basis for sustained cooperation. And knowledge written, spoken, encoded in tool designs and navigation methods became survival insurance against the loss of any individual who carried it, because it existed outside of any individual mind. Each of these was not merely a tool. Each was a redirection of causality. Humans stopped adapting to environments. We began adapting environments to us. This marks one of the genuinely profound transitions in the history of life, the moment a species stopped evolving primarily through biology and began evolving through something biology had never produced before. Deliberate, cumulative, self-accelerating engineering applied to the problem of survival. The landscape no longer set the terms, we did. It is tempting, looking backward through deep time, to see the outcome as inevitable. We are here. We survived when every other human species did not. Surely something about us was always going to produce this result. Surely the story was always going to end with us. The evidence does not support that comfort. Early Homo sapiens populations went extinct. Multiple expansion waves out of Africa failed completely, leaving no detectable genetic trace in any living human. Then, approximately 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano erupted in what may have been the largest volcanic event of the past 2 million years, triggering a volcanic winter lasting years, a cooling period lasting decades. Genetic analysis suggests this event reduced the entire human population of the planet to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from a group that could have gathered inside a single sports arena. We were, by any reasonable definition, on the edge of extinction. The margin between survival and disappearance was not wide. It was narrow, contingent, and dependent on specifics of geography and timing and luck that could easily have resolved differently. Slightly different rainfall in the refugia where survivors sheltered. One disease introduced into an already stressed population at the wrong moment. A single bad decade where the last connected network of Homo sapiens was trying to hold on. Any of these in the wrong combination. And the story ends not with Homo sapiens dominating the planet, but as another extinct lineage in the fossil record, found in a museum case next to the Neanderthals and Denisovans and all the others who almost made it through. Human dominance was not written into the structure of the universe. It was won, repeatedly, in conditions that could have gone the other way. That is not a comfortable thought. It may be the most important thought in this entire story. When we look back at human prehistory, it is almost irresistible to read it as a story of superiority. We survived, therefore we were the best. We dominated, therefore we were the strongest. But the deeper story, the one genetics and archaeology and climate records all point toward, may be something else entirely. Not that we were the best humans, but that we became the most connected humans. Not that we were the strongest, but that we built survival systems with a structural strength no individual body could match. Not that we were destined to dominate, but that we learned slowly, at enormous cost, how not to disappear. The real breakthrough was not intelligence alone. Neanderthals were intelligent. The Denisovans appear to have been intelligent, but intelligence that exists only in individual minds resets with every death. The breakthrough was continuity, the ability to preserve knowledge across the deaths of the people who generated it, to transmit hard-won survival strategies to people not yet born, to turn fragile, short-lived human lives into something durable, into systems that grew stronger with each generation rather than resetting. That is the quiet revolution that allowed one vulnerable primate to outlast every other human lineage. Not conquest, not superiority. Survival architecture, the slow, accumulated engineering of systems stronger than extinction. Which raises the only question that matters more than any fossil or ancient genome. If our ancestors survived because they built systems stronger than the forces that erased every other human species, what systems are we building now? Connectivity still determines resilience. Knowledge that is not shared still dies. Systems that stop adapting still fail. The Ice Age is over, but the question it left behind is not.